poverty and wealth. Bishop Dagmar at the beginning, she highlighted the fact that this is a significant theme in Luke's Gospel. We know, don't we, our Lord said that no one knows the day or the hour of judgment. But for preachers, I can tell you that the next hour of judgment falls on the 7th of September 2025. The first Sunday probably after your summer holiday. Because on that day, the Gospel reading ends with those devastating words of Jesus, "You cannot be my disciple unless you give up all of your possessions." Lord have mercy. I hope that what follows will help you prepare for that day of reckoning, or at least for a day of wrestling with the theme of poverty and wealth, which is so distinctive. But before I give you any of my opinions, I should say that there is a centuries-long debate about the place of poverty and wealth in Luke and the book of Acts indeed, with some very strong disagreement. So maybe we'll have some of that here today. That would not be a bad thing. I think it's also important to say at the beginning, as you well know, that preachers are also disciples, or at least they hope to be. And that means that we need to be prepared to do our own inner work when we come to these texts. I assume that I am not the only person here who is rather hoping to find an exegesis for the 7th of September 2025 that doesn't require me to give up all of my possessions. I don't think any of us approach the text with that hope. In the same way that I hope that I can exegete other texts in other Gospels without having to pluck out my eye or cut off my hand. When we turn to the Gospel texts, we have to remind ourselves that hearing the Gospel, really hearing the Gospel, entails a willingness to hear the call of Christ where we find it the most difficult. We should also, I think, as preachers, be honest about our desire to be crowd pleasers and our fear of upsetting the faithful. I'm sure that every preacher here, I know I'm one of them, is guilty of pulling punches sometimes. In a consumer society, we might feel an urge to sell Christianity in the marketplace of competing ideas and lifestyles, but we have to ask ourselves, is Christianity really a low-cost, low-risk endeavour? And I think this aspect of Luke's Gospel reminds us that we have to consider the cost. We also need to be mindful of our situation in life as interpreters, and we've already had a flavour of this from Isabel in her address earlier. We are not first century Palestinian peasants or very low-paid artisans who were the majority of Jesus' followers. Nor do we come from the most marginalised classes in our society, probably, let alone from the most deprived classes across the world. We may have little, if any, experience of the kind of oppression associated with severe economic disadvantage. So we are biased readers of the text, and we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of the fact that we may not be able to understand the message of Luke unless we hear what it sounds like to the destitute and to the powerless. Liberation theologians are so good, aren't they, at reminding us that we should be careful about spiritualizing themes that might more naturally have a practical reference. And that's probably enough of a pep talk. There's probably one other thing to consider before we look at what the Gospel actually has to say about poverty and wealth, which is that it stands against a much greater biblical background. Luke is not the only text in the Scriptures that consider poverty and wealth. And I discovered through, I can't remember if it's Google or ChatGPT, one of them. There are roughly twice as many verses in the scriptures on the subject of poverty and money than there are about faith and prayer put together. Twice as many about wealth and poverty than prayer and faith put together. So I think that is an invitation for us to consider how prominent is that topic in our preaching and teaching when it is so prominent in the scriptures. There is also a rich seam of thinking in the Old Testament about what are known in Hebrew as the Anawim. Some of you will be familiar with that. And they crop up particularly in the Psalms. The Anawim are understood as the poor, not simply as a socio-economic group, but in the theological sense of those who continue to depend on God despite their adversity. Now that adversity often is socio-economic, but it is about that, the poor who depend on God despite their adversity. We do need to be careful with this because it too easily leads to that rather lazy attitude that says it's perfectly okay to be rich so as long as you don't care too much about your stuff. What I think the teaching about the Anawim points to is that unless a person is open to the need and anguish of the world, including their own needs and their own anguish, it's difficult to see how they can hear the gospel. The good news of the kingdom is only good news to those who are looking and longing for it. The banquet of the kingdom tastes best to those who have an emptiness that needs to be filled. So as I say, there's lots of inner work for ourselves and deep reflection on what the scriptures have to say as we approach Luke's text. What does Luke say then about wealth and possessions? Well, like the rest of Scripture, the gospel text is intractable. You can't reduce it to a set of neat formulas or propositions. As the Roman Catholic scholar Luke Timothy Johnson has said, the problem we face is that although Luke consistently talks about possessions, he doesn't talk about possessions consistently. I think that's an invitation to us rather than a criticism of the text. The scriptures address many different people and different situations, often in the form of a narrative, rather than in the form of abstract principles and concepts. And so the scriptures draw us into the work of interpretation as we are drawn into the stories that we read there. But it's still, having said that it's a disparate body of material, I think it's still helpful to think about the subject of possessions under two main headings. These are good news for the poor and resistance to wealth. I'm then going to finish very briefly, mention some problem texts and some difficult texts. Some of the most striking material about the poor in Luke's Gospel comes from the uniquely Lucan material that Bishop Dagmar highlighted for us, which comes in the first chapter of the Gospel, which kind of set the scene. They begin to highlight some issues and concerns that are going to be important for us to bear in mind as we journey through the rest of the narrative. We've already noted, or Bishop Dagmar already noted, compared to Matthew, the poverty of Jesus' birth. No magi, no expensive gifts, just poor shepherds. And then one of the most treasured passages, which James has already referred to, recited daily by many at evening prayer, the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, which takes up the Old Testament theme of God's preferential option for the poor. Mary is clearly in this text inspired by the Song of Hannah, which you can find in 1 Samuel chapter 2, but also other texts like Psalm 146, which proclaim a great reversal of fortunes. God turns things around in favour of those in need. The proud, the mighty, and the rich are put down, while the humble, the meek, and the hungry are uplifted. So it's a key text positioned right at the start of the narrative. And then we have Zechariah's song, which includes this line here, famously, doesn't it? To give light to those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death. Many who would read that text would think of themselves and the darkness of oppression and suffering that comes from poor material circumstances. And then there's the preaching of John the Baptist. A fascinating figure. But the thing to notice here is that although John is asked the question, what then should we do? So they're wanting to know about their own responsibilities. The answer he gives is good news for the poor. He talks about collecting no more than is prescribed for you, for the tax collectors. And to the soldiers, he says, do not extort money from everyone. This is clearly ethical advice for those who are in a position of power, no doubt about that, but it's good news for those who otherwise can be taken advantage of by the powerful. So it's a message for the rich, certainly, and we'll come on to that, but it's good news for the poor. And then Jesus, so this is John's first sermon, if you like. And then, of course, as has been mentioned a couple of times, we have Jesus' first sermon back in Nazareth, when he gives this Nazareth manifesto, which is unequivocally good news to the poor. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Whatever else the gospel is going to be about, and of course it is about many things, we've already heard some of the richness of that today. Whatever else the gospel is going to be about, Luke clearly wants to say, right at the very beginning, that it is about good news for the poor. That socio-economic issues are right there at the heart of the good news. This is what gospel good news looks like. So the stage is set for the rest of the story. The first time Jesus preaches, after he has chosen his 12 disciples, apostles, he gives what's known as the Sermon on the Plain, to contrast with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. I put the text side by side. I doubt whether you'll be able to read them. But let me just remind you of what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Plain. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. The similarities between the Matthean and the Lucan versions of this sermon only serve to highlight the clear differences between them. And while I do think it is right in our interpretation, it's right to understand the poor in Matthew's metaphorical or theological sense of the poor in the spirit, a bit like the Anawim of the Old Testament. When we come to Luke, we cannot avoid seeing also a socio-economic element. The two can coexist. There is a poverty of spirit and there is poverty, and they are both connected to what the gospel is all about. When you add this to Jesus' other teachings about the first becoming last, the servant becoming the greatest, the gifts of the poor being of more value than the gifts of the rich, it's clear that his mission was aimed particularly at the materially poor. God's concern expressed through Jesus is good news for poor people. When John the Baptist's disciples go and visit Jesus, if you remember, and they ask him, "Are you the one that we were expecting? Are you the Messiah?" Remember what Jesus says. He says, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the poor have good news preached to them." If you want to know what the Messiah looks like, he's the kind of person who preaches good news to the poor. So this is a first order gospel issue. I think Luke makes that plain. Lastly on this topic, there are two key parables. We've already had a look at these to an extent. There's the Good Samaritan. Clearly a story that does invite those who have means to consider how they use them in service to the poor, but at the end of the day, it's those who are downtrodden who benefit. The actions of the rich, as it were, if they follow the advice of Jesus, will be good news for the poor. And then there is the great banquet of Luke 14. This is an interesting one to look at. Again, you won't be able to see this, but you know the story. There's a big banquet. The people who are supposed to come don't come. But notice the difference. In the Matthew version, which is on the right-hand side, we're told that the servants of the master go out, invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. In the Lucan version, bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Not quite everyone. It's a very specific group of disadvantaged people. In the Matthean version of this parable, it's an ethical parable, you might say. And in the Lucan version, it's a socio-economic one. It's about class. And then there's the rich man and Lazarus. This is one of those parables where it's very tempting to read something out of the parable that is not actually there. At no point does the parable tell us that the rich man ends up in Hades because he didn't treat Lazarus very well. All we're told at the beginning of the parable is that the rich man's in his castle, feasting every day, and Lazarus is at the gate, wishing that he can have some food. In life, the parable says there's no actual interaction between them at all. And likewise, at no point does the parable tell us that Lazarus has done anything to deserve his eternity in the bosom of Abraham. All the parable tells us is that in life, Abraham was rich and Lazarus was poor, and in death, Lazarus is in the place of privilege and Abraham is in the place of distress. Their fortunes have been reversed. The key to this parable is surely in the name of the poor man, Lazarus, which comes from the Hebrew El-Azar, which means God has helped. The implication is that poor Lazarus has come to a good end because God has helped him. God has made it so. That's what God does, if you remember. God raises up the humble and the hungry. Good for Lazarus, at least in the end. But what does it mean for the rich man? Are we simply to conclude that he ended up badly because God didn't help him? I'm going to come back to that in the next section when we think about the place of wealth and riches in our lives and in the gospel. But again, notice that this parable is good news for the poor. So the second major theme in Luke's gospel is about resistance to wealth. And by far the largest category of material on wealth and poverty falls into this category. Luke is so packed with warnings against wealth that some commentators argue that the gospel was actually written for a rich audience who were trying to figure out what to do about the fact that they were so materially advantaged. Well, I hope that the foregoing section will have shown you that I don't actually think that's the case. I think this is a gospel for the poor as much as it may be a gospel for the rich. But there is certainly a lot for the rich amongst us, which, let's be honest, in a world situation is all of us. There's a lot for us to take on board. We've already heard about Jesus' Sermon on the Plain with its warnings for the rich and the satisfied. I say warnings, they're actually curses. Cursed are you who are rich. About as strong as Jesus ever gets in the Gospels. And there are 3 occasions in Luke's Gospel when Jesus specifically curses the scribes and the Pharisees for their love of money. This is no Jesus gentle, meek and mild. This is Jesus at his most difficult for us to hear, I think. And as religious leaders of different kinds who are far from destitute, we should be sitting up and taking notice, surely. What else does Jesus say? Well, he preaches unlimited almsgiving. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. That's Luke 6:30. He seems, at another point, to forbid the lending of money at interest, Luke 6:34-35. When he teaches his disciples to pray, notice, the only thing that they can ask for in terms of a sort of material possession is daily bread. Or as some people describe it as the bread of our need. Not the bread of tomorrow or yesterday, not a secure, materially secure future, just the daily bread. And at a dinner party in Luke chapter 14, Jesus warns against inviting those who can return the favour, and instead suggests that we only invite those who can't. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Jewish contemporaries, who saw wealth as a sign of God's blessing, Jesus sees it as a rival God. You cannot serve God and mammon. Luke 16:13. And Jesus himself sets an example of wealth avoidance, doesn't he? He self-identifies as homeless. Foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Luke 9. When he needs a coin to illustrate a point of teaching, he has to ask someone to lend him a denarius. And in line with his example, Jesus' early disciples give up their possessions in order to follow him. This is where the text is really interesting. Cool? That wasn't what I was expecting to come next. Here we go. So, I've got here all 3 versions of the sending out of the disciples. The version from Mark, and then there are 2 aligned versions in Luke. And you'll notice that in the Markan version, he sends them out, but they can wear sandals and they can have a staff. But in the Lucan versions of this, they are specifically told no staff and no sandals. They're sent out with the absolute bare minimum. And then when you come to look at the cost of disciples as it affects Jesus' immediate followers, again, you've got Mark and Matthew here who make it very clear that when he called the brothers by the lake, they left their father Zebedee in the boat and followed him. That's Mark. And in Matthew, immediately left the boat and their father and followed him. In Luke, very explicitly, they left everything and followed him. So there's a clear common material that all 3 gospel writers are working with, but Luke makes it very clear that they left everything. And again, when we see the calling of Levi or Matthew, the tax collector, in Mark, he gets up and follows Jesus. In Matthew, he gets up and follows Jesus. In Luke, he got up, left everything, and followed him. This is not, friends, I think, an accident that we see this particular emphasis in Luke's Gospel. And then we have this, these parallels. On the right, they're from 2 different parts of Matthew, talking about the cost of discipleship, and then aside, we've got Luke 14. And Luke's version is just so much harsher and stronger than Matthew's version. It's longer too. Matthew simply says that if someone loves their family more than they love Jesus, then they're not worthy of Jesus. But Luke goes far, far further than that. Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. It's not just about being worthy of Jesus. No one can even be a disciple if they hold on to other relationships. And relationships, of course, in the ancient world, family was your material security in a way that doesn't apply to us quite in the same way now. You know, in the same way that when Abraham was told to go, to leave his people, he was taking a huge risk. He was cutting off all of the security that being part of a wider clan and the associations give. Luke then goes on to tell two stories about counting the cost of a project, of course, meaning counting the cost of the project of following Jesus. And, the point is, if you are a potential disciple, are you ready to pay the price? Have you calculated that? And what is the price? Well, then you get this absolute killer. None of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. There is no parallel in Mark or Matthew or indeed John with this jaw-droppingly absolute pronouncement. Now I'm going to go back to the one that came sooner than I expected. Yeah, one of the very few episodes that is common to all four of the Gospels is the cleansing of the temple. And this, you might think this is a marginal point, but of course it comes within the bigger context. You note that in Matthew's version of this, and you'll find this, we're told that the transactions in the temple were linked to the life of the temple. So you've got the buying and selling of animals, because that's in connection with temple sacrifice, worship, and you've got the exchanging of money, because you needed to be able to pay the temple tax using the temple currency. And so the activity that's going on in the temple that Jesus condemns in the Etheldreda version is about kind of transactions in connection with worship and sacred space. You don't get any of that in Luke. It is simply about transaction. Very simple. He began to drive out those who were selling things there. It doesn't mention that it's in connection with worship or sacred space. It's just about the transaction and the suggestion that those who are kind of profiting are robbers. Again, it's a relatively modest thing, but it helps to reinforce this clear sense in Luke's Gospel that there is a problem with money and the use of money. And then we have some parables, important parables, the parable of the rich fool and of the rich man and Lazarus, which both make it clear that wealth is a danger to followers of Jesus. I've already talked about the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich fool speaks for itself. And then lastly on this topic, there are the two encounters. There's the encounter with Zacchaeus and the encounter with the rich ruler. Both encounters that are about money, wealth, possessions, etc. One ends well, one ends badly. And it's worth looking at how Luke relays the story of the rich ruler. Luke doesn't introduce him as a man, as Mark says, or as a young man, as Matthew says. Luke says he is a ruler, an archon. So this is a person of considerable status. And in the ancient world, status and wealth typically went hand in hand. And while Matthew and Mark later describe the man as having many possessions, if anyone wants the Greek, exon ktemata pola, Luke uses a different phrase. He actually makes exorbitant wealth part of the man's character or identity. He says he is extremely rich, and the emphasis it's engar plusios sfodra. This phrase plusios sfodra indicates spectacular wealth, really. So he is kind of emphasising the fact that this man is not just a man. This man is high-ranking and wealthy, and these attributes are part of his identity that come into a conflict with Jesus. And at the end of Mark's version of this story, the man leaves the scene before Jesus continues his teaching on wealth and poverty. But in Luke, the rich ruler just becomes sad, but he hangs around to hear what comes next. So he is there to listen as Jesus continues to expound on how difficult it is for the rich to enter the kingdom. Jesus speaks to the rich ruler directly in his presence when he says how hard it is for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. And in Mark's version of this story, the disciples express surprise when Jesus gives this teaching. If the rich can't be saved, well, who can? In Luke's Gospel, the disciples express no surprise at all, which is not surprising, isn't it, given everything that they have already heard from Jesus up to this point. They're not surprised to hear that it is hard for those who have great wealth to enter the kingdom of God. I'll end this section by returning briefly to Lazarus and the rich man and Lazarus. And I think there's a really interesting way of approaching this text that for me helps my own engagement with all of these texts around wealth and poverty in Luke's Gospel. I pointed out earlier that there is no clear explanation in the parable as to why the rich man ends up in Hades and the poor man in the bosom of Abraham. The only clue we have, in a sense, is that the poor man is Lazarus, the one who God helps. And I think we are supposed to take this really seriously. I think we're actually supposed to face the possibility that God either cannot or God will not save the rich. It certainly chimes with some of the challenging words that Jesus has said, that we've already discussed. You cannot be my disciple unless you give up all your possessions. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. I don't think that Jesus tells us straightforwardly whether wealth is good or bad. He doesn't tell us straightforwardly how the rich are supposed to help the poor, though surely they must. He doesn't give us a neat formula so that we can calculate precisely just how generous we have to be to make our way through the eye of the needle. And maybe you find that infuriating. I think this is because Jesus doesn't want us to have a comfortable life. I think Jesus wants to keep us on the edge, facing the possible prospect of our own ruin, so that we can never forget the poor at the gate, and we can never escape our own fear of loss. I think Jesus deliberately leaves us with the problem as a provocation, which we have to live with and we have to attend to all our lives long. There is no simple, neat solution to this. It will keep coming back like salt in a wound that never quite closes for us. Wealth and possessions and the plight of the poor, in other words, are inescapably first-order issues for those who are thinking about what it might be to be the people of Christ. There are, however, some problem texts that possibly don't quite fit in with this picture. The first is the patron, the apparent patron of Luke's Gospel. We don't actually know if Theophilus was a real person. You know, it's very convenient, isn't it, to have a friend of God or a lover of God as the patron. So it could be a no one, or it could have been a wealthy patron, and it would have been a wealthy person, and therefore very likely a Roman citizen, so really, really wealthy in the ancient world. And it could belie the idea that the gospel, as Luke presents it, is a gospel that is seriously questions wealth and that is very much for the poor. Of course, by the other side of it, he might have had a wealthy patron and wanted to write a gospel that would test the patience of his patron by pointing out that his wealth might be a problem. And who knows, Theophilus may have engaged in some sort of renunciation that we're never told. There are also Jesus' rich female patrons. They're introduced to us in Luke 8, and we discover that they provide for him throughout his life, and they show up at the end of the story to attend his burial in Luke 23. There's also Joseph of Arimathea, who is another person who appears at the end of the story, and clearly a person of means, who is able to serve Jesus from his own wealth. And there are his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And they invite him to dinner parties in their home. These are clearly people who are not dispossessed. So Jesus, as is clear, does spend time with and has deep friendships with people who are not socioeconomically poor. Rather more tricky, perhaps, in some ways, is the centurion in Luke chapter 7. This is clearly a person of considerable means. He has at least one slave for a start, and he has enough surplus resources to be able to build a synagogue for the Jewish community in Capernaum. So, this man he's got plenty. And Jesus never condemns his wealth, never condemns his slave holding, which is possibly a little bit tricky for us, never condemns the power that comes with his wealth and status. He never suggests any amendment of life to this centurion in Luke 7. He heals the slave and points to the centurion as a model of faith. Well, I think I would say about that this story is primarily told as a story about Jews and Gentiles, and contrasting the faith of a Gentile in connection with the lack of faith, the lack of trust, the lack of support that Jesus receives from so many of those in his Jewish tradition. It's not really a story about wealth, but it does relate to wealth, and it might make us feel a bit uncomfortable, particularly around slave ownership. We may be left with a troubling feeling about that story. And there are also some difficult texts in Jesus' teaching. Twice, once in Luke 8 and once in Luke 19, Jesus gives us the same saying: to those who have, more will be given, and from those who do not have, even what they seem to have will be taken away. It troubles my thesis. It troubles my thesis. It appears to present an ideal in which economic disparity increases rather than lessens. But as so often, context is everything. And in the context in which Luke places this saying, economics don't seem to be the point at issue. He's talking about other things. What's on the table here is understanding specifically the disciples' ability to understand Jesus' sayings. Those who listen well and understand his sayings will gain ever more understanding, while those who fail to listen and understand will become ever more clueless. Then there is the parable of the faithful manager, which imagines a slave who is in charge of other slaves. If the slave manager mistreats the slaves he manages, then the master will punish him on his return. But on the positive side, this suggests that God demands fair treatment for the poorest of the poor and the least of the least. But again, this master also demands that even those who have unknowingly done wrong be beaten. And the parable ends with a saying that cuts both ways, which I've already referred to: from everyone from whom much has been given, much will be required, and from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. On the one hand, it suggests that those of means have a greater responsibility for caring for the poor. But on the other hand, it still puts God at the head of a hierarchical system of domination in which certain persons are ordained to exercise authority over others, which might make us feel uncomfortable as we hear that story. There's also a short parable which is unique to Luke, in which the disciples are asked to imagine themselves first as masters and then as slaves. That's in Luke 17. And Jesus suggests that if they were masters, they would not congratulate their slaves for completing the work. They would instead demand more work from the slaves. In like fashion, Jesus says the disciples should not expect congratulations for their work, but should instead say to themselves, "We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done." Again, it's a parable that can sort of cut both ways on the wealth and status spectrum. And again, seems to put God in the place of a slave master, and in this case, an ungrateful slave master. The slave metaphor is, of course, really problematic for us today, as we try to preach good news to the poor. Although I suppose asking the disciples to consider themselves as useless slaves could be seen as an act of solidarity with the poor. Good luck with all of that. Most notorious of all of these difficult texts is the parable of the unjust steward, or the shrewd manager in Luke 16. Bishop Dagmar mentioned this at the beginning. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of people have sweated, maybe even sweated blood over this text over the years, as we all will on the 21st of September 2025. Book your holidays now.
We're going to book you to preach there.
I think this really is one of the hardest passages to preach in all of the Gospels, and probably in the whole of the New Testament. It's hard to make sense of it. You need to look at your commentaries for this one, and you can get some plausible explanations. They do exist, but none of them seem to be quite watertight. I think, in terms of my theme today, what I want to highlight is that at the heart of the story, whatever the sort of weird ethics around it, at the heart of that story is the forgiveness of debts. And let's be honest, the forgiveness of debts is pretty much always good news for the poor. So whatever the morals of the manager, it's the poor who benefit in the end. And as Dagmar pointed out, the steward concludes that whatever the circumstances, generosity is the best policy.